Well, that was very thought-provoking. We have a challenge, but I also think we have a great opportunity. And one of the things that I want to talk about today is how we're changing the conversation around personalized medicine. I'll share with you just a bit about Genomic Health. I'm assuming most in the audience are familiar with our company, founded about 15 years ago. So if you had asked me if it would take 15 years to be having this debate today, I would have thought it would have happened a little earlier, but I'm glad it's happening, and I'm glad the conversation has continued. Just a reminder that we are a public company, and I will be making forward-looking statements, so please refer to our SEC filings and specifically our risk factors as you look at our business. So how far have we come? I think a long way. When we talked about Genomic Health in the early days and the type of company we wanted to build, majority of us coming out of the drug development side and commercialization, it was really around how can we change the way cancer is being treated. So clearly we had a one-size-fits-all treatment method for cancer, and we wanted to specifically focus on early stage cancers because we knew that's where the greatest overtreatment was happening. So when you look across these areas of focus for the company, early stage breast cancer, early stage colon cancer, early stage prostate cancer, we had a common problem when we went out and we talked to oncologists and urologists. We know most of these patients will do fine by having their tumors removed and their disease followed closely, but what was happening is we were treating them very aggressively. So to give you a statistic, in early stage breast cancer, only 4 in 100 women actually benefit from chemo. In colon cancer, it's about 3 patients in 100 benefit from chemo if they're early stage. In prostate cancer, the question's around radiation and surgery. And we know in early stage prostate cancer, most men will never die from their disease. In fact, it's less than 3%. Yet we're doing aggressive surgeries and radiation on 90+% of patients. And those are US statistics I'm giving you there, but it doesn't get much better when we look across the globe. So clearly there's a problem there and a problem with resource allocation, but how do you not offer a patient that aggressive treatment? If you can't figure out who the 3 or the 4 in 100 are, we offer it to everybody. That was the problem we were addressing when we founded Genomic Health. And we have successfully now launched tests in all 3 of these areas that get at this issue in early stage cancer about, do I need aggressive treatment, and could those healthcare resources be spent differently to better diagnose the disease up front. But it required a lot of clinical evidence and a lot of studies, which I'll share a few of those with you. And then you layer in the economic piece, which is really the focus of this panel, so I want to spend a little bit of time on some of the work that we've done there. Real quickly, this is the world we walked into. For me, it was a bit surprising because I had come out of the drug world, and so when I learned that diagnostics were reimbursed based on activity and not on value and not on the way that, like we did with drug development and commercialization, bit surprising, and we said early on we need to change this. So how are we going to go about doing that? Payers expecting them to be cost neutral at best. Very different than the drug world. And standards of evidence to support any kind of value-based reimbursement were clearly lagging in this field. And for precision medicine or personalized medicine to ever be a reality, we knew that had to change. So we started right away working with payers to say, what are the questions that you're asking? And they really fall into 2 buckets, right? So there's the clinical piece and there's an economic piece, both of which want to talk about cost effectiveness, but then there's also a budget issue or a budget impact issue that you'll look at over on the economic side. On the clinical side, it was really around what level of evidence needs to be addressed, and where are the standards there. And what we knew then, and we still know today, we really haven't set those that standard for the level of clinical evidence, but it's something that we're working on with many stakeholders in the field right now. And I think the conversation, again, is moving forward in a good way. So Mike mentioned, how do you weigh the cost versus the benefits? And here's just a quick way to look at. Clearly, we think the benefits far outweigh the costs, but the costs are there. So how do you take the cost of these diagnostics that aren't the cost of a traditional diagnostic? And when you think about the way we've looked at diagnostics in the healthcare equation, we spend less than 2% of our healthcare resources on diagnostics. The rest is spent on the other pieces of our healthcare. So how can that be, right? So if we have all of these tools that Mike was referring to in terms of the technology improving, why is it that we're spending so little of our resources on diagnosing disease up front? And this is especially important in cancer because we know cancer is a molecular disease. So how is it that we could be recommending, whether it's chemotherapy or any therapy, to a cancer patient if we're not understanding what is at the molecular level driving their disease? We've got the tools to do that today. We have to figure out how to get those incorporated into routine clinical practice at a cost that is cost effective or cost savings to the system. So we can talk a little bit about how did we go about doing that. Our first large payer in the US that actually adopted Oncotype DX, and this was the breast cancer test, was Medicare. And what we had to do with Medicare is work very closely with them for a number of years. So imagine, if you're coming from a world where a drug gets developed, you go through phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, the FDA approves it, you put a price on it, it gets paid for. In our case, hundreds of millions of dollars go into developing the diagnostic. We get it out into the marketplace, and all of a sudden we find there's no pathway for reimbursement. So it took 2 to 3 years to actually get this first test reimbursed. That can't be our future, and we knew that that had to change. But when we went to Medicare and said, this is new, we can't take our test and crosswalk it or fit it into anything you have in your system, the activity-based CPT coding system. So we had to come up with another way to introduce what we were saying was high value or value-based pricing, which was something they had never done. And over a number of years, we were able to come up with this list of criteria that Medicare was looking for. We worked to establish what I would call for lack of a better word, a baseline of which you said, okay, this is what we would want to see. Oncotype DX for breast cancer was approved. A number of other tests started to follow. And Medicare was very interested in having a list of criteria set for other companies to go by as well. And that's the checklist there that you'll see. Now, this is Medicare in the US. You'll see as you look around many other areas, tech assessment review bodies, the same questions are coming up. So again, accuracy, utility, can you tell me that the results are actionable, really important, and I'll talk about how we delivered answers around that as well. What's the budget impact? Is there cost effectiveness here? What model was used to determine that cost effectiveness? So as we looked at the clinical evidence, and this is just to demonstrate how very important that was. If you look at the trajectory of the growth of the breast cancer test, so this is back from 2004 when we launched, and you'll see to Medicare reimbursement, and you look in the orange boxes, that's when the clinical evidence became public, presented, and published. And it wasn't until we got to a lot of published evidence that we would call level 1 evidence, peer reviewed, that we really started to see payers cover. And so you see the payers popping in here, and in the gray box over on the right-hand side, you're looking at when the predominant larger payers, private payers in the US started to cover Oncotype. So it was at this point we decided, okay, if we've made this progress in the US, it would now be the time for us to start to look outside the US to go and make sure that we could provide global access to patients around the world. So we've started these same processes in other countries outside the US now. And what's nice is that this clinical data that we've generated, again, like I said, it's 15, 20 studies, thousands and thousands of patients, has led to practice guidelines by independent review to include St. Gallen, ESMO, NCCN, ASCO, and that's really important. So as we look to, how do you establish that level of clinical evidence, these are the review bodies that are really going to look at that and weigh it against what else is already out there, what are the competitive products that might perhaps be in the marketplace, and how does this compare to what we were doing. And what we had to show is that if you use the Oncotype DX test, whether it be for colon cancer, prostate cancer, or breast cancer, that in fact there would be cost savings and that we did have a cost-effective model. But we couldn't do that without going out and demonstrating that. And we then put a considerable amount of resource into doing that. I'm going to show you a couple of examples here just quickly and then talk about how we've moved this around the world, literally. This is a meta-analysis of some studies that were done in Europe. And what you're seeing there in the top box is what would have happened with these high-risk patients had the Oncotype DX recurrence score not been used. So you see in that top box, those women in red, or figures highlighted in red, would have received chemotherapy. All in green would not have received chemotherapy. The test was introduced, and you see the change there on the bottom. So now we're looking at a considerable change. We see far fewer patients getting chemotherapy. And in the bottom row, this is really important because we often talk about the use of our test in reducing the amount of chemotherapy or the amount of surgery. But there's also what potentially is a life-saving component here, because those red figures now on the bottom that went from getting no chemo to getting chemo, those would have been patients that were presumed to have been very low risk, perhaps not getting chemotherapy, and actually needed it. They had very aggressive disease. And we've seen this happen over and over again, where you may have a really small tumor, a pathology grade that doesn't seem to be progressive or aggressive, and in fact you'll get a very high recurrence score, and these are patients that need immediate treatment with chemotherapy. So the test works really both ways, and very important as we figure that into the economic analysis that we do. So again, same look. I won't go through the slide in detail, but in Ireland, another study done to look at what happened with chemotherapy usage. And in this particular study, we also looked at the economic impact. And you see a cost savings or a health economic benefit there. And you also see a similar type of shift from patients going from chemotherapy to no chemotherapy and vice versa. Next one, done both in the UK and in France. Again, so we have gone everywhere, every market that we've been in, we've had to demonstrate this over and over again. And the data that we're seeing is very consistent from the US across all countries. So we see on average, treatment decisions change anywhere from 30 to 40% of time when a recurrence score is used, and we're seeing very similar shifts in the use of chemotherapy. And clearly for payers, this is great, because one of the things in the US as we helped payers track their patients post-usage, it was very clear that chemotherapy use was going down as the use of the Oncotype DX test was going up, which is of course what they would want to see, and that's what we would be factoring into models going forward. Just a list of an example of how many places we've done this to demonstrate this impact. And I share it because I don't think this bar will get lower. I don't think it will be okay that we demonstrated this with one test and it will just be accepted that anything else that's introduced will have the same effect. So companies need to realize that this type of investment will be necessary going forward. We're doing the same thing with our prostate cancer test right now. So continuing to invest heavily. The slide I showed when we first started this conversation, these are big markets with large potential. We actually think with the 3 tests that we have today, we could be at $1 billion in revenue by 2020, but we sit here today 15 years in and we're not a profitable company. So that's the type of investment that's been required to get us this far. We don't see those costs necessarily coming down, which is why it is very important that value-based pricing in diagnostics, in precision medicine become a topic of conversation in a different way going forward. I wanted to bring in the example of NICE because I think it's important, not just because we're sitting in the UK today, but also, again, this process. So NICE recommended the breast cancer test over 18 months ago. Based on, if you see there highlighted in orange, some of the same things. Clinical evidence, analytic validity, looking at the test, picked the Oncotype DX test relative to others that they were looking at based on their criteria, which is similar to where Medicare is and other of the large payers in the US. This was terrific news. It was really, in some ways the first, large Western European country that actually came forward and put a positive recommendation in for the Oncotype test. But what happened here is once that recommendation came through, had this been a drug, it would have immediately been reimbursed and patients would have had access through the NHS. And because of it being a diagnostic and being different, it actually took us 18 months to work through this decision from NICE into actually getting access, which just happened this past April. So very pleased that we've gotten there. And why did that happen? It really became more of a budget issue and conversation, but it was also an issue around what is the mechanism to get a laboratory service through this process, because these are new tools. This is not the traditional diagnostic that payers anywhere around the world have been incorporating into their plans over the past decades. So very new, but very promising, and we're very pleased to be able to say today that all patients, both private and publicly covered patients in the UK, do now have access to Oncotype DX, which has been a goal of ours from the beginning, and we need to do that now in all countries. This is just a quick look at where we're headed next. Now, prospective clinical studies, and Mike had mentioned we need to be thinking about doing things differently. Well, this is one area where we can't do prospective clinical studies, the traditional placebo-controlled, double-blinded, randomized clinical studies in this world, because if we did that, especially if you're talking about early stage cancer, we'd have to wait 10 to 20 years to see outcomes. Well, that's not really feasible. The test would be obsolete before we saw the data. So what we have begun to do 15 years ago were retrospective clinical studies, with prospectively defined endpoints. And that worked well. But we had to introduce that concept of a new way to doing development into the system. It is now widely accepted. It doesn't mean that we don't want to do prospective studies, and we've started some of those. So early on with the NCI, we started a prospective study. This is an example of one that we started with a West German group. So we're very interested in following the patients that have been oncotyped 10 years ago since it's launched and into the future to follow that. And what you're seeing here, this is a group of patients, high risk, that have been followed. They will continue to be followed. And these were patients that were put into the study. Those that had low recurrence scores were given hormonal treatment alone and not chemotherapy. And what you're seeing there at 3 years, there's a 98.3% recurrence-free survival rate. Well, that's phenomenal, right? So these are patients that would have had chemo that likely don't need it based on the recurrence score, or don't need it based on the recurrence score. So while we're doing these sorts of prospective studies, they can't be the norm for getting tests into precision medicine, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't do them to learn and to follow these patients out into the future. So going forward, just a couple of minutes here on where we're headed, and I know the speaker before, Mike, talked about liquid biopsies, and this is something that Genomic Health has been working on for several years. So I talked about starting our business looking at early stage cancers. And what we would like to be able to do is also help patients where their cancer is diagnosed later stage. And in particular, those patients that may have an early stage diagnosis, their disease becomes metastatic over time. And the way that we believe we can do that and really transform how cancer is treated is by looking at this a little differently. So you take an early stage diagnosed patient, we would imagine that all those patients would get some sort of baseline tumor profile. We would be looking at that tumor profile from the original diagnosis. Upon a recurrence, and we've done this now with a number of patients, we've got several large studies going on, we would want to be monitoring that patient's disease over time through what we would call a tumor burden assay. So we're monitoring the disease. We continue to get a negative result from this assay. That's fine. The patient is doing well on the current therapy that they're on or not. Once we see a positive result from this burden assay, we would then start asking more questions. Okay, why is the disease recurring? What changed from the original signature that we have from the original diagnosis? And when we have that information, we can say, okay, here's what's different. In the studies that we've done, both in breast and bladder cancer, what we see when we're looking at the signature in the blood, we actually see a tumor, a signature very similar to what we saw originally in the FPET tissue. But we also see points of interest where there are slight changes. And those are the clues that patients need to figure out where to go next. What is my next best guess? Where is the next best treatment for me? What is the pathway that's causing the cancer to continue to progress? Those are the drugs I should be going to look at my treatment. And you can imagine now, if we can do this test out of blood, and we can do it frequently, much like we monitor cholesterol, we could very quickly see whether a patient's responding to a drug. So rather than waiting 3 months to do an expensive PET scan to see if a tumor's growing, we actually in the blood can monitor that tumor burden, and if it's at bay, we would continue on that therapy. If it was elevated, we could look at the patient and say, well, maybe they're not on the right dose. Maybe we need to increase the dose of the drug. Maybe it's the wrong drug. So again, this becomes a constant loop. But a way to really treat cancer real time and in a less invasive manner. Now, what's going to be very different here, though, is that these tests can't be, and back to the economic discussion, they can't be $3,000, $4,000, and $5,000 tests if you're going to be using them multiple times on patients. So the trick here is to take the technology that we have today. Those costs are coming down, but we have to get them down further, and we have to do the clinical studies to demonstrate that what we're finding here is clinically actionable. Because that's what payers are going to want to see before they pay for it. So is it interesting to see your genome? Perhaps. but a payer is not necessarily interested in paying for something that's interesting but not actionable. So I think there's going to be a phase here where we spend a lot of time looking at some of these tools for research to learn a lot, and Mike presented a lot of ways that that can happen and we believe will happen. But in terms of routine clinical practice and getting precision medicine there on a routine basis is going to require a lot of clinical evidence and the proof that it is actionable and cost effective to deliver this to the system. So with that, I'll say thank you, and I think we might have a panel discussion coming up.